As we struggle our way through the pandemic and through the consequences thereof, it becomes more important than ever to concentrate on the fabric of society, of justice, of the rights of the incarcerated, of the rights of other populations that are at risk and vulnerable. My next guest has been and continues to do his part in all of that. Janos Marton is a lawyer and a criminal justice reformer. He has worked for many years representing the relatively powerless against powerful interests in the city of New York. He is now a candidate in the upcoming Democratic primary for Manhattan District Attorney, which is a ways out. It's June of 2021. Perhaps normal life will be, or something like it will be resuming by then. But at this moment in history, these kinds of struggles remain important. So first of all, Janos Marton, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much, Richard. Great to be here.
Secondly, I want to start with this. Obviously, when you announced for district attorney, we didn't know, I suspect we didn't know exactly what was coming down the track for us. But before we get to the present moment, what made you decide to run for district attorney?
Sure. And one of the things I'd love to talk about is many of the issues that we're fighting for and reforms we're fighting for are because our jail and prison system are fundamentally broken. And we're seeing that in real time today during the COVID-19 crisis. So in some ways, all the reasons to run remain stronger than ever right now. But to share a little bit about myself, I'm born and raised in Manhattan. I grew up here in the 80s and 90s, and during the 90s was subjected to stop and frisk and aggressive policing under Mayor Giuliani. And that really informed a lot of my early activism and made me want to become an organizer. And I became an organizer and worked around the country after college and came home to New York to become a civil rights lawyer. And I practiced for a number of years as an attorney, and then also working on bigger systems change, running the campaign to close Rikers Island, for example, and then running the ACLU's National Criminal Justice Program, Smart Justice. And throughout all of that, I've known that the district attorney has an outsized influence in how our criminal justice system operates. And in Manhattan, we've had a very problematic DA for quite a long time, Cy Vance. And as this wave of progressive prosecutors sort of sweeps the nation and allows communities a chance to revisit who they have in these important positions, I felt like our communities, especially low-income communities of color, were not well served by the incumbent, and decided to challenge him last year. And so now we're in it, moving forward.
So first of all, I have to tell you, as a former Manhattanite, this may show my New York DNA. At first, when you said you grew up in the 80s and 90s, my reaction was West Side or East Side. But then I realized you meant the 1980s and the 1990s. I know about your work regarding Rikers Island and the ACLU, really important work. And, I know that not every attorney graduates law school and decides, to fight for those causes. Let's pivot for a second to Cyrus Vance, the current district attorney of City and County of New York, son, I believe, of a district attorney, certainly politically connected family. You've mentioned your view that he's not serving communities of color well. It is my impression, following economic and corporate issues, that he is also not serving working people in general as well as he could, to say the least. I've been disappointed with him on a number of issues. There are also questions, as I recall, about his handling of some Me Too cases and so on. But just a little bit about Cy Vance. Why are you running against Cy Vance?
Sure. So under Cy Vance, Manhattan's really perpetuated a two-tiered system of justice, one in which low-income communities of color face pretty steep penalties. Manhattan sends, New York County sends more people to prison than any other county in the state. It has fewer alternative incarceration programs, less leniency for people being caught for the first time. So it's really a harsh system of punishment for certain communities. On the other hand, when it comes to powerful and connected people, Cy Vance's office has looked the other way or not followed through in cases over and over again. And in the beginning, it was sort of an open question of whether it was about competence or corruption. But the reality is, at this point, 3 terms into his administration, either way, the results are pretty clear. If you have access to high-priced attorneys, you can probably get out of it in Cy Vance's DA's office. Now, examples of that include the Trump children getting out of a fraud case when their campaign lawyer made a when their attorney made a $25,000 campaign contribution to Cy Vance's reelection. You have Jeffrey Epstein, who during his case, the Manhattan DA's office sought to downgrade his risk level. And then you have Harvey Weinstein, who of course was famously prosecuted recently, but that was only because of Ronan Farrow's reporting. When the DA's office had Harvey Weinstein in their crosshairs 5 years ago, they actually declined to prosecute him despite police evidence of his wrongdoing. And so this is just sort of there are many other cases you could cite, but there's a long pattern of Vance's office being unwilling to take on the connected and powerful. And to the point that you just made, there are other examples of that outside of high-profile individual cases. He's been pretty reluctant to tackle the issue of wage theft, which is one of the issues that we're talking about in our campaign, that is going after companies that don't properly pay their workers, and also unwilling to bring political corruption cases. There's been virtually none brought during his tenure, even though corruption has been sort of swimming in New York politics, well, really forever, but including in the last number of years.
So a couple things about that. Again, Janos, Marton. One is in terms of Cy Vance. My impression, which you're kind of confirming for me, is a little bit that his thinking comports with, for example, former Mayor Michael Bloomberg's more than it might with the people of New York City, Manhattan County, and so on. In that but correct me if I'm wrong, but he strikes me as a kind of broken windows policing kind of guy. He strikes me as a guy who thinks the best thing to do for his city is let the rich and powerful prosper, maybe not maybe not conducting himself in the office with a full awareness that the last I looked, 50% of New York City proper lives in poverty or close to poverty. So it seems to me that this is not a DA that's representing the people of his city or their legal interests. But am I off base with this sort of broken windows Bloomberg kind of?
Well, absolutely. That's it's a good observation because frankly, you see this among a lot of the NYPD leadership in New York as well. I mean, I talked about growing up in the 80s and 90s on the other side of that policing, but if you were a prosecutor and coming up in the 80s and 90s, if you were a beat cop coming up then, there's a certain mentality that was instilled that people of color are the other and they're causing crime, and so we have to be as harsh as possible. So I think that absolutely bleeds into not only his own thinking, but those a lot of the people in the higher ranks of his office, which is a largely white leadership in a very diverse borough and very diverse city. And Cy Vance is hardly the only person who I think is sort of stuck in the past in this way. You see this in the way Governor Cuomo talks about criminal justice reform and a lot of other people from a past generation. So the good news is we have a chance to sort of move forward as a city and state and elect a district attorney like myself who's in touch with community values around the same time that we'll be electing a new mayor, a new city council, and eventually a new governor. And so I'm hoping that we can turn the page as a city and really elect a full field of candidates who live up to the progressive values that our communities believe in.
And again, we're talking with Janos Marton, lawyer and criminal justice activist, candidate for the 2021 Democratic primary for Manhattan District Attorney. And you mentioned two-tiered justice. I guess where I'd like to go now, for the sake of our audience, is a lot of people aren't entirely clear on what a district attorney actually does. I mean, they know he goes after, supposedly goes after bad guys and, that kind of thing. But in a city like New York, you have the federal system of prosecutors. You have and of course the federal courts, you have the district attorney who serves, a slightly different function. I mean, you can't, as I understand it, as district attorney, one doesn't process, for example, SEC violations or something like that. So maybe if you wouldn't mind just taking a minute to explain what a district attorney can do in general, what a district attorney for New York can do, and your thoughts about it.
Absolutely. And it is, criminal justice system is a messy, complicated thing. So people can totally be forgiven for not knowing it all off the top of their heads. But I'll try to break it down. The Manhattan District Attorney is responsible for administering justice and keeping people safe, particularly with an emphasis on their jurisdiction, which is in Manhattan or New York County. Each one of New York City's 5 boroughs has its own district attorney. Most counties in America have a district attorney. And that district attorney's office processes all criminal cases brought to it by law enforcement that are within its jurisdiction. So the DA's office makes the decision when a person is arrested, for example, whether to charge that person, to dismiss the charges, what to charge them with, whether to offer them an alternative to incarceration, whether to really come down hard on somebody, what kind of sentences to seek over the course of the plea bargain process or a trial. So there's really a lot of discretion with how district attorneys manage people who have been accused of crimes, and they're very powerful in the criminal court system for that reason. And it's important to have a philosophy from the top of the district attorney's office that guides the assistant district attorneys on what justice looks like. Does it mean the absolute harshest punishment in every case, or does it mean actually figuring out how to hold a person accountable in a way that will stop the cycle of harm from happening? Is there an underlying reason this person is committing these offenses? And if so, can we get the person the help that they need, whether it's mental health services, substance use treatment, into some kind of economic program that will get them on a legal economic track? If it's a young person, getting them to finish, their education and be part of an after-school alternative to incarceration. There's a lot of different ways we can get people's lives on track so that they don't keep harming people in the same way. And a lot of that comes from the discretion of the district attorney's office. Now, that's about how the DA responds to day-to-day street crime, which is really a major function of the office. There's also the function of the office where it is investigating cases on its own or in conjunction with other partners in government. And so when I talk about, for example, employers committing wage theft, you might have an example where there's a tip from a worker that this so-and-so construction company has been skimming money and not paying undocumented people that they're supposed to, or paying them below minimum wage. And so a district attorney's office can investigate that kind of wage theft on its own in conjunction with NYPD, with other government agencies, and bring a case on its own. So those are really, in broad strokes, the two types of ways that a district attorney's office like Manhattan can function. And I feel strongly, having worked around the country for the ACLU, that New York, with its immense resources, I mean, the Manhattan DA's office has far more resources than most DA offices. We have the ability not only to respond to day-to-day street crime, but also to take on powerful interests with our office. And there are limitations. You mentioned SEC cases where we're not allowed to go after federal cases, and there's, theoretically a federal Department of Justice that's supposed to be doing that. And, for all the terribleness of the Trump administration, there's still some excellent lawyers who are in the Department of Justice in New York. And then, of course, there's the New York Attorney General, which often focuses on more sort of civil offenses that we don't have jurisdiction under at the Manhattan DA's office. So it is a sort of tangled web of different bodies that administer justice in New York. But the easiest way to think about it is when you have day-to-day crime in New York, which office is going to be responding to it, and what is a sensible, fair, just way to do that?
I think that is a good way to think of it, Janos, Marton. And also, I would assume that, for example, if you're investigating wage theft and in the course of your investigations were to find out possible avenues of investigation for cases not in your jurisdiction, you would be able to refer them to the appropriate people as DA, right?
Absolutely. That kind of referral work happens all the time. Mm-hmm.
And again, we're talking with Janos Marton, lawyer, criminal justice advocate, and candidate for the district attorney's race in New York City in 2021. But everything starts early and lasts long nowadays. I wanted to talk to you. I mean, there are two, and it's emerging in this conversation as well. There are basically kind of two fields of activity. One is how, for the district attorney, as I see it, one is how one fairly and justly performs the district attorney's duties for the lack of a better word, the working people and the majority of the people in the jurisdiction, both in terms of handling potential violations of the law, prosecuting, and so on, and in terms, of course, the collective safety and well-being of that community. And the second is how one governs and polices the privileged, who I would argue, whose misdeeds are amplified. Each misdeed has the potential to affect thousandfold more people than a street crime. But so do you feel that there, and you mentioned other progressive prosecutors running in cities like Philadelphia and so on, do you feel there's a new vision of how to perform the DA function for an urban population like New York City? Do you feel that there's one emerging, or that there's one that can be articulated and demonstrated further in a city like New York?
Absolutely. And I think the framing I would give to anybody who's listening to this and considers himself a progressive is, why not treat the district attorney's race like you treat every other race? And remembering that this is a democratically elected, it's a small d democratically elected position, and in many cities it's a big D elected position, right? So for many years, we've had a system in which the rise of mass incarceration, tough on crime rhetoric, and politics has been perpetuated by both parties. And the difference between a Democrat and Republican on criminal justice was at times so difficult to tell that you actually have plenty of counties across the country where district attorneys run for election on both the Democrat and Republican line, and stay as incumbents and for 30 years until they retire and are replaced by their deputy. That's basically been, in many counties in the United States, how the politics of district attorney races have gone on. And what I'm hoping to do in New York is shake it up the same way it's been shaken up in places like San Francisco, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Chicago, where somebody comes along who's progressive, who's a reformer, who ultimately really is the same coalition as candidates would running for other offices in the city, like for mayor or city council or state senate. And I'll tell you, here in Manhattan, you can't get elected to Manhattan City Council if you're bad on criminal justice, or at least you're not supposed to be. And yet we allow district attorneys who are really bad on criminal justice issues to be reelected here all the time. So that's really what we're trying to do, is bring the district attorney's office into the democratic process, actually challenge incumbents and make sure that if you're a Democrat, you're represented by a progressive district attorney. So in a way, the philosophy around what is a progressive district attorney isn't that different than the rest of the things that we value as progressives, which is, fairness, opportunity, making sure that we're trying to fight for politics in which people have access to resources, access to housing and mental health and physical health, job training programs to get out of poverty, safe housing. These are all things that we care about as progressives, no matter what particular office we're running for. And to have a district attorney who shares those values is going to make it a lot easier for other parts of the system to work.
What you're saying, it seems to me, Janos, Marton, is that criminal justice reform, an essential part of progressive politics, is a critical factor right now in Manhattan race, except for the office that administers criminal justice. So
historically, yes. Although we're changing that, and so far so good.
Okay, well, good to hear. And let's talk for a second. Let's go back to a subject we touched on a little bit earlier, which is, metaphorically speaking, the broken windows I see are on Wall Street. The broken windows I see are in the corporate world. And now we're in a crisis where light is shining through a million broken windows in corporate America in terms of profits over people, in terms of not telling the truth, in terms of not not even proper management of their own corporations. Now, I understand that federal violations are not part of what the district attorney of New York does. But having said that, you mentioned wage theft, which is rampant in the corporate world from the studies I've seen. There are, what other forms of, and I know you probably don't want to come in with, a perceived prejudgment against any particular organization, but what other sorts of corporate malfeasance are within the jurisdiction of the district attorney?
Sure. And so you mentioned wage theft, and I mean, just for people to put a number on it, there's more. We're talking billions of dollars per year over the country, and certainly in New York, probably it's been studied at around a few hundred million a year, perhaps. And that's more money than is stolen from, petty larceny, burglary, robbery combined. I mean, this is where the money is really stolen in this city, is through wage theft. So it's a big issue. I would say, corporate business fraud. There's plenty of state laws that the Manhattan District Attorney's Attorney's Office can prosecute that are within its jurisdiction over fraud cases. There's also the issue of antitrust. It's not something that historically District Attorney's Office have done very much with, but we're very much looking into what we can do using state antitrust law, which is modeled off of federal antitrust law to go after illicit corporate behavior. But in general, I could keep rattling off different types of cases we could do, but what we're going to make clear in how we orient the office, how we staff it, who we hire, who we put on our community advisory board, which we're going to set up so that we have regular communication with people from the community, is we're going to be tough on crime when it comes to corporate crime, and we're not going to bend over for anybody. I was special counsel earlier in my career to the Moreland Commission, which was the anti-corruption commission in New York State, and we investigated Democrats, Republicans, big donors, special interest groups. And I even got in trouble for investigating Governor Cuomo and ended up becoming a whistleblower against him as the commission was wound down. And so I say that just to illustrate that there's no way that I can be bought and that anybody who I'm going to bring on my team can be bought. So we're going to start looking under, seeing what's under the hood. And if we don't like what we see, we're going to go after people no matter how connected they are politically or economically.
Let me give you what in this case would be a hypothetical, Janos, Marton, but and if you feel that it would be inappropriate to answer, then don't answer. But when I was investigating and reporting on bank criminality in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, one thing I saw very often was, for example, a homeowner would have a mortgage contract. And the mortgage contract would say you pay X amount on the 15th of the month. And suddenly their mortgage would be bundled and sold, and they would receive a notice of late payment on the 10th of the month before the payment was due, and with a fine of $350. This happened time and time again, sometimes led to people losing their homes. Is that the kind of thing that in some future scenario, a district attorney might step in and say, this is wrong and must be stopped?
Yeah, absolutely. It could be. I mean, it's interesting hypo just because, Manhattan, right. We don't have, it's a lot, mostly people living in apartments. And I should right. say, by the way, that, if you look at sort of who the corporate bad actors are in places like Manhattan, I know this isn't a direct answer to your question, but, large landlord companies that violate the rights of tenants is actually something that probably affects a lot more Manhattanites.
Right.
That example, but it's the same. But basically, the fact pattern isn't that different. In that, what you'll often find in these landlord-tenant cases is that an individual tenant might feel kind of helpless or confused about their case, and only as sort of tenant organizers put it together, they realize there's been a pattern in practice. And all of a sudden, you realize that the same company has been doing this in 30 buildings around the city for years, and now you've got a case. There's been a documentary out recently on Netflix called Dirty Money that shows that basically this is what Jared Kushner this perpetuated a late fee system illegally to try to milk as much money as possible out of his tenants. So had Jared Kushner, been doing that in Manhattan during my tenure as DA, that is something that we absolutely could have gone after. So even though I'm not answering your exact question, basically the point still stands that if our office can detect a larger pattern in practice of corporate misbehavior, we can devote our resources to going after it.
And again, we're talking with Janos Marton, a candidate for district attorney in the 2021 Democratic primary. So, no, that's an excellent answer. And being, having a New York background myself, I hear tenant horror stories all the time. I'm not investigating it. It's so commonplace, as you know, in New York, these kinds. So I'm going to have to go back to Cyrus Vance for a second and say, why aren't we seeing more prosecutions of this?
Oh, well, yeah, I don't know. You'll have to ask Cyrus Vance that. I would say that it would always, to me, there's always two possible answers. And we know there's no political will. And the question is really, is it because they're afraid to tussle with landlords and other people in the real estate industry who are very powerful in New York? Or is it just that, I guess the question is, is it corruption or is it just sort of fear on Cyrus Vance's part? Because from what we've heard, actually, is a very prominent assistant district attorney was investigating landlords and was fired recently. And I don't know enough detail. We're waiting for more details to come out about that, so I'm not going to say any more than that. But I mean, there certainly is reason to believe that Vance's office pulled the plug on investigations into landlords even in the last years. So I mean, that's kind of where I think his office leadership is with this issue.
Okay, last question for you. I'm not deeply familiar with all of this, but I would, if I were guessing, I would say that as you pose perhaps an increasing threat to Cyrus Vance, it may be that a lot of campaign contributions will come in. Will you be up against big money? Will you have to need people power support because there's going to be a lot of cash going through, or am I being overly alarmist?
Oh, absolutely. You're absolutely spot on. In fact, for some reason, district attorneys' races have never been subject to campaign finance reform in New York. So Cyrus Vance has historically gotten contributions of $25,000 and $30,000 from individual people in his races. In fact, the last time he ran, his average donation was around $1,000, which, spoiler, mine is a lot less. We're at about $50 per average donation. So I would certainly welcome the people power of anybody who's progressive and believes in the vision that we've been talking about to go to janosforda.com, janosforda.com, and learn more about our campaign. If you live in Manhattan, you can get involved with it. Even in this coronavirus situation, we've been doing digital online organizing to try to mobilize people who are most affected by these issues.
Well, you saved me my last question. You've obviously, you're a natural at this. I was going to ask you where people can go. They now know. So Janos Marton, a lawyer, criminal justice reformer, and now candidate for district attorney. Thank you for all your great work, and thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me.